Welcome to Security Dilemma, a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. I'm AJ Manuzzi, joined by my co-host John Allen Gay, as we have a conversation today with Dr. Michael Neagle. Dr. Neagle is a professor of history at Nichols College, as well as the author of Chasing Bandits, America's Long War on Terror, which is his most recent book, and America's Forgotten Colony, Cuba's Isle of Pines. In this episode, we discuss chasing bandits and the ways in which U.S. policymakers and politicians have leveraged popular understandings of so-called bandits to mobilize public support for war abroad. Join us as we have a conversation with Dr. Michael Neagle. Dr. Michael Neagle, welcome to Security Dilemma.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
We're here to discuss your book, Chasing Bandits, America's Long War on Terror. As followers of the Society will know, we just hosted a reading group on this book a couple of months ago, and we're really looking forward to the chance to discuss it with you. Could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this particular book at this particular moment?
So the genesis of this project came back probably in 2014. I started at Nichols College, which is in Dudley, Massachusetts. Started teaching an undergraduate course there about the War on Terror. And at the time in 2014, this is a conflict that many of my students had grown up with, that many of them still had 9/11 in their lived memory. I had a handful of students here and there who had served abroad, who had been in Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere. And I wanted to do a course that historicized this contemporary conflict. And so the initial version of the course, as I was doing research on it, I was finding all these other instances well before 9/11 of these different individuals who the United States was pursuing, and doing so in similar ways, describing these people in similar terms, that I just found striking. And as a historian, the central question for historians is to assess change or continuity over time. And I just saw this great deal of continuity. And so the initial version of this class addressed some of these individuals who I cover in the book, to the extent that I didn't get to 9/11 until well after the midterm. And I had a few students who were like, Professor, this is a course on the global war on terror. Where's 9/11? And so I have kind of morphed the class since then. But that version of the class kind of inspired me to think that there is a book here. And I wanted to, again, try to historicize the contemporary global war on terror. And the individuals who I have researched on, I find they are described in very similar ways, which I'm sure we can get into over the course of the conversation. And the utilities of these depictions, I think, is also something I want to bring to the surface. Not necessarily to challenge the notion that some of these individuals really weren't that bad or not so bad after all. I'm not trying to rehabilitate anybody's image, but I wanted to bring up to the surface the continuity here of the United States constantly being in these kinds of pursuits, but also why is it so useful for the United States to pursue these kinds of individuals. And so it kind of morphed from there, where I narrowed it down to 6 individuals, primarily over the course of the last 125 years. Since the War of 1898, or the Spanish-American War, the United States becomes unquestionably an overseas empire. I think there are some good arguments to be made that the United States, was an empire before that, and probably has been since day one. But unquestionably, after 1898, when the United States is taking colonies and exerting itself more forcefully in global affairs, I think these individuals, these non-state actors, are people who I think are useful in helping the United States to develop its imperial project over the last 125 years.
Yes, the main argument that you mentioned throughout your book is that U.S. politicians and policymakers have consistently mobilized, with varying degrees of accuracy and utility, pejorative descriptions connoting criminality or incivility labeling non-state actors as bandits, savages, guerrillas, terrorists. You roll through all these. Essentially to garner public support for war, for expansive rules of military engagement. It carries with it a whole set of interlocking assumptions about how these actors work. They can't be deterred, they're not rational, their aims might be unlimited, and therefore you can't pursue any sort of diplomacy with them, and you have to...
Might be subhuman almost, yeah, like
exactly,
inferior. Yeah.
So I would love to hear just how that mechanism works and why policymakers find it useful.
Yeah, so these kinds of terms, I think they help to justify the United States going abroad to some of these places of strategic interest. I'll take the Philippines, for example. So the first chapter opens up with the war in the Philippines and the pursuit of Emilio Aguinaldo, who was leading the Filipino rebels against the United States starting in 1899. And the method of their resistance and the fact that they were pushing back against the United States will compel American policymakers and the press and military officials to describe these individuals as savages. And that depiction not only justifies the idea that, well, if the United States is the civilized people, we have to tame these savage individuals who are putting American interests at risk. And the terminology also helps to justify the bending or breaking of established rules of engagement. This is a fairly new concept at the turn of the 20th century. But the idea that these individuals, these rebels, particularly in the Philippines, if they're savage, if they are uncivil, illegitimate, criminal, then the United States does not have to abide by its established rules of engagement to go after these individuals. And this will then enable the United States to use things like the so-called water cure, which was a method of interrogation and torture, frankly, that instilled the sensation of suffocation and drowning, literal drowning by pouring buckets of water down somebody's throat. It enabled the raising of villages to try to weed out rebels. And I think the language and the depiction of these individuals using that kind of language would then justify the breaking or bending of these established rules of engagement. So I think that was... the terminology is really important here in enabling the United States to do that.
One of the things I found interesting about this is in reflecting on it is that, there's this narrative and that you say kind of comes into play, that we bring in this concept of banditry, lawlessness, et cetera, and that it's deployed in areas of strategic interest. So like the United States, of course, has strategic interests in Mexico, where Pancho Villa is, in Nicaragua, where Augusto Sandino is, et cetera, and that this might be, and I guess what I'm trying to understand is, do you think that this is necessarily a calculated move by policymakers to deploy these ideas to boost public support? Or are they caught up in the narrative themselves? Because when I was reading a lot of these documents, I was thinking, it seems to me like they almost believe it themselves. And I think, having been in Washington for the outbreak of a number of conflicts, also just remembering, being an American after 9/11 and in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, how visceral these feelings were, but also like the times I've been in Washington, it seems like policymakers are sometimes the people most caught up in some of these narratives because they're the ones following it day to day. How does this work? Is it a deliberate kind of ploy, or is it like an idea that assails us and we all get caught in?
I find it more the latter than the former. It's a great question. I do not necessarily see any instances of them using these terms in a calculated, deliberate fashion. Like, okay, what word can we call Pancho Villa? Oh, how about outlaw? Let's go with that. And these are terms that I think have been embedded from previous generations. So I'll take the Philippines example. In the first chapter, they're often referred to as savages, these rebels. And that stems from the 19th century Indian Wars, where American Indians were constantly labeled as savages. And then that gets embedded into the Filipino conflict, in large part because many of the American military officers in the Philippines after 1899 are individuals who had been part of the Indian Wars of the 19th century. So these things kind of build off one another. And so I found it to be less deliberate and more unconscious, where there's something in the ether about how do we just pick these individuals as distinctly other than Americans. So if the United States considers itself to be good and civilized, well, these people who are challenging us are the distinct opposite. So they must be savages, bandits, criminals, and so forth. And so I think these things just build off one another. And, the terminology, I try to make the case in the book that the terms shift over time. The popular terms shift over time. Savage and bandit, and then bring it up to the present where it's now terrorist. But I try to make the case that these all basically mean the same things, to connote criminality and incivility and illegitimacy of both cause and means. And so the terms might be different, but I think the ideas are still the same. And I think that the utility of it is still the same with all these individuals, with these. And again, I'm principally referring here to non-state actors, private citizens. I'm not referring to heads of state. I think that's a very different kind of category of enemy, given the kinds of resources that a head of state has at their disposal. So I am making that distinction here. But in terms of the terminology, I think there is something in the culture, in society, in American society, to try to cast enemies as distinct opposites of what the United States ostensibly stands for.
Yeah, I'm interested in, since you mentioned the Indian Wars, why not really put those in your narrative? Because I know in our discussion groups on this, one or two people definitely were like, hey, what about, Tecumseh and Geronimo and, I think Chief Joseph, like some of these other figures who had kind of a similar dynamic around them. How did you set the scope here?
I'll give you two reasons. First was just in terms of the sense of the scope of this. I wanted to primarily look at non-state actors. And I found some of these American Indians. Tecumseh was one. He was an initial draft that I had. But American Indians at this time were, semi-sovereign people. Yeah. I was thinking of the Barbary pirates of the late 18th century as well. I think could make a case to fit them as well. But that's also kind of semi-sovereign states. I wanted to look principally at non-state actors in the era of overseas American empire. And so certainly I think there is a case to be made of Tecumseh and the Barbary states to be part of this as well. But I wanted to kind of narrow the framework a little bit to the era of American empire and to stay exclusively with clearly non-state actors. The other reason was because this is probably taking me another 2 years to write this book. So that was kind of the more practical reason where I'm like, I got to cut this off. I've been working on this for about 7-8 years now. I think it's, I work probably a chapter a year where I work. I'm teaching a 4-4 load for the most part.
Oh boy.
With 2 young kids and stuff like that. And so I'm kind of hammering out a chapter a year, but for practical reasons, like, okay, I need to cut this off somewhere. But it also fit in, I think, with the broader framing that I was trying to do relative to overseas American empire since 1898.
Hey folks, exciting news. The Jon Quincy Adams Society is pleased to announce its 2026 Summer Conference for early career professionals and college students. Participants spend 4 days engaging with thinkers, practitioners, and scholars. It's an opportunity to step back and examine some of the big, fundamental questions about American foreign policy at a time when those questions are more pressing than ever. With major transformations underway in the U.S. national security space, policy shapers in all parts of the political spectrum will need to feel comfortable talking not only about tactics and tools, but also about goals and ends. The 2026 conference will proceed in 2 major parts. First, our participants will talk grand strategy, a state's theory of how to cause security for itself. This Morgenthau Grand Strategy Seminar centers on small seminar-style discussions with rising international affairs scholars, conducted in partnership with the University of Notre Dame's O'Brien Notre Dame International Security Center. The program bears the name of acclaimed realist IR scholar Hans J. Morgenthau. Participants come away with a richer understanding of what grand strategy is, theories that can animate grand strategies, and applications in key regions and issue sets. This comprises the first evening of the conference, the second full day and most of the third day of the summer conference. Second, participants will dive into policy and practice. They'll take part in a crisis simulation that puts them in the shoes of key decision makers. They'll hear from bipartisan panels of experts on pressing topics in U.S. national security, including dissections of the latest conflicts and their meaning for U.S. strategy and security. They'll connect with professionals who can share secrets of success, and they'll do all this in a cohort of their future peers, current and aspiring U.S. foreign policy professionals. This comprises the third evening and the closing fourth day of the conference. If you're interested in applying for the 2026 summer conference, don't miss out. Go to jqas.org/2026-summer conference. We'll post the link in the show notes, and we look forward to looking over your application. Thank you, and now back to the show.
Yeah, I found the the conclusion. One piece of the conclusion is very interesting. So this narrative, like, it seems like something that kind of really clicks for a lot of American leaders and for American publics. It has these aspects of utility to it in that it boosts support and makes us feel good about ourselves relative to our enemies. But you also say it actually doesn't seem to help us that much. And in fact, the results of using it in the cases that you study are almost paradoxical. Take us through that.
One of the things I was thinking about in reflecting on these 6 case studies, to what extent is the United States successful in these pursuits? And in some cases they are, in some cases they're not. But what I found is that in the cases, and sorry if this is a spoiler in the book, the couple of cases where the United States doesn't find its man, Pancho Villa and Augusto Sandino, I think the United States is still able to achieve its broader objective of securing the border relative to Mexico, and also in Nicaragua to ensure that there is a peaceful transition of power. Now, there are going to be broader consequences to this, certainly. But anyway, what I found is that, so in the cases where the United States is fails to get their man, they still achieve their objectives. But when they do get their person, the broader conflict continues. I have a chapter on Pablo Escobar. And Pablo Escobar is killed with United States help in 1993. That doesn't end the war on drugs. There's a time when Pablo Escobar is the running face of the contemporary war on drugs, which certainly predated him and has continued ever since. Global war on terror. It really kicks off post 9/11. Osama bin Laden is the primary objective in this global war on terror. He's eventually killed in 2011, but we still have the global war on terror. I think is still going on to this day. It might be on simmer compared to some of the other conflicts that the United States faces right now, but it's still going on. And so one of the things I do question in the book. And I don't have any easy answers myself, but I at least wanted to raise the question: is what's the effectiveness of these military responses, these military-oriented responses? And I think certainly with the global war on terror, to have militarized what previously had been more of a criminal justice kind of approach, tremendous cost. Yes, we've prevented, a group like, Al-Qaeda or its ilk from staging any sort of attack, anything close to 9/11. But to think of the cost involved, not just in dollars, but in terms of lives, and not just American lives, but lives of people in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who were killed and affected by these conflicts. So tremendous cost, and that's what I'm trying to raise in the conclusion of the book. What is the effectiveness of militarizing these kinds of operations? How does it square with costs? So that's kind of where I'm trying to raise those questions, at least in the book.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's been several instances, despite this narrative of criminality, we're not actually using criminal tools to go after these folks. There was an explicit rejection of having a trial and everything be the goal of the pursuit of bin Laden. We ended up not getting that with Escobar. It seemed the Colombians might have killed him rather than have all that. But I wanted to, kind of dig into this a little bit more on this question of, it seems like in several of these cases, Pancho Villa and Sandino in particular, you found where people are almost questioning exactly what label applies to the activities of these figures. They say, okay, they have bandit things that they do, where they will go and loot places or steal things. But then there are also insurgency things that they do. And people will say, well, hey, some of this is just normal for a guerrilla movement to seek resources from the area where it is active. How do we navigate that?
So one of the things that was important for me is to try to understand differing perspectives at the time. I think there is a dominant narrative of Pancho Villa, for example. After the attack on Columbus, New Mexico in March 1916, he's labeled a bandit, savage, outlaw, all sorts of stuff. And there's a real, and from reading the contemporary newspaper accounts, there's a real vitriol against Pancho Villa from coast to coast. And some of it had stemmed from, I think, a sense of betrayal. Pancho Villa had been fairly widely known even before this, briefly seen as an American ally during the course of the Mexican Revolution, somebody that the United States feels comfortable with, can maybe do business with. But for a variety of reasons, the Wilson administration kind of pulls its support and goes with one of Villa's rivals, and Villa then sets his sights on the United States. But there is this real sense of vitriol against Villa. And that's the dominant strain that I read at the time. There are also instances in which, and I think it was the New York Times in particular has an editorial about a year after the attack on New Mexico that questions, like, is he really a bandit? Are we just misunderstanding him? And I was struck by it because here's an example of a publication that was cutting against the grain of the dominant narrative relative to Villa. And I wanted to highlight that because I think it's important to show that not everybody in 1916 and 1970 was thinking the exact same way about Pancho Villa. And I think it is important when we're studying history to consider alternative perspectives and to try to navigate all this to tell a broader story, but that it wasn't universal, the vitriol against Villa. And I think likewise with Sandino, there were questions during the course of this Nicaraguan campaign. Sandino really a bandit? Wasn't he fighting for patriotic reasons and to really to try to restore Nicaraguan sovereignty? He saw the presence of U.S. Marines there as a violation of Nicaraguan sovereignty. And again, the dominant narrative was that Sandino was a bandit, that he, President Herbert Hoover calls him a plain bandit in the midst of a press conference. That's also used by other individuals in positions of power. That's the predominant narrative. But there are examples at the time where people are calling that into question. The journalist Carlton Beale of The Nation goes down to Nicaragua. He interviews Sandino. I believe he's the only American journalist to do so. And, getting a lot of Sandino's perspective into a popular outlet like The Nation, I think was very important. And Beals is also questioning, well, is Sandino really the bandit that the Hoover administration is portraying him out to be? What is it that the United States is doing in Nicaragua that's leading Sandino to want to push back on this? And Beals is highlighting some of Sandino's charges that the United States has been razing villages, raping women, killing prisoners, and so forth. And he's, Beals is going to bring that to a popular American audience, where then even by 1932, there's members of Congress saying, what are we doing here? This is also in the midst of the Great Depression. And so there's questioning about what are we spending this money on in the midst of a depression. So I thought it important in the story to show some of these differing perspectives at the time. Although I do maintain that the dominant narrative is still that Pancho Villa was an outlaw, that Augusto Sandino was a bandit. This is what I think many, if not most, Americans of the day felt about these individuals. But there were others who cut across the grain, and I think it's worthwhile bringing those voices into the story as well.
I wrestled throughout reading the book with like, okay, yes, he's bracketing whether these guys are good or bad, and how he's discussing about this. But they seem, some of them seem pretty bad, and you have to remind you, no, he's not. You're not weighing in on that here, because I think stepping back from that a little bit lets you look at in maybe a little bit more of a structural perspective and say like, okay, like, there was clearly a lane for someone like Sandino in Nicaragua because the United States was so involved in Nicaragua's internal politics. We should not be surprised that something like this emerged and that our presence was related to its emergence. When he started out, he was kind of a nobody. He was a minor figure in one of the factions of the Civil War, and basically says no to a peace deal, has, a small number of guys with him, and turns it into something much bigger. And it seems to me that a good chunk of that is because he's opposing the big bad United States, that it gives him an ability to mobilize support that's not there, but that might not be there otherwise.
With Sandino, it's not that he has this big giant movement against the United States. He probably at his peak only has a couple hundred fighters in the rural mountainous area of Nicaragua. He doesn't really gain much of a following outside of this area called the Segovias, but he's just enough to be a thorn in the side of the United States. And he is going to inspire, maybe not others in Nicaragua at the time, but he is going to inspire other like-minded revolutionaries across Latin America in the ensuing decades. And then when the Somoza family falls in the late 1970s, the group that's going to take over is going to be named in honor of Augusto Sandino, the Sandinistas. So it takes a while for Sandino's platform to really kind of take root across Nicaragua, and it's going to happen decades after his death. So it's not that he had this big movement at the time. He generally was ignored, particularly in urban areas of Nicaragua at the time. But again, just enough of a thorn in the side of the United States to draw attention for so many years.
Coming back to Pancho Villa for a minute, I mean, two little data points that really stood out to me in your narrative. That the attack on Columbus was the deadliest attack on the continental United States until 9/11, if I have my memory correct, and yet, not long after this, I mean, one, you have this, fairly open discussion of his motivations in major newspapers. You also have the governor of New Mexico pardon some of Villa's captured men, and basically says, it seems to me, he says they're more like prisoners of war, that they didn't realize that they were attacking Americans and the United States. They thought they were attacking Carranza's guys and his towns. But then also that there's a state park in New Mexico named after Pancho Villa. I mean, this is just truly like we don't have a Hideki Tojo Pearl Harbor Memorial or something like that. It really makes me wonder, about the change in how these terms and concepts and ideas have been applied, that we almost could be more willing to have a conversation about these guys back then than I think you could have now.
Yeah, I mean, I was stunned when I was doing research for this to find there's a Pancho Villa State Park in New Mexico where, in the location where he staged the attack. I mean, that's like having, Osama bin Laden Park in downtown Manhattan or something like that. And in the things that I read about it at the time, even the locals didn't like it. It was coming more from the state house as opposed to the locals. The locals like, what are we doing here? So there was certainly a divergence of opinion with that.
And then on Villa, you talk about how it seems like it's not entirely certain exactly why he started attacking the United States when he did, but that it may have been a desire to provoke a response, because that would put his opponent, Carranza, in this really nasty position of having to either fight America, this very strong country that has, at times supported him, or suffer the humiliation of presiding over the presence of all of these foreign forces on Mexican territory. And that made me think, what should policymakers nowadays be taking away from that? And, how should we handle these situations where we might be creating these kinds of incentives? Because part of me wonders if it's even something that we can get around, creating this incentive to go hit Uncle Sam to raise your own status or create challenges for the rulers wherever you are.
Yeah, when individuals are using what we would now call in the 21st century tactics of terror, that it's designed in part to provoke a response. And my read of VIA is that, well, let me quick sidebar here, is that, if VIA had done what he had done in 2016 rather than 1916, he'd be called a terrorist rather than a bandit. And I think if you have 9/11, if you have September 11th, 1901 versus September 11th, 2001, somebody like Osama bin Laden would be known as a bandit back then. I think those terms, they're not necessarily interchangeable, but I think the meanings and the understandings are pretty much the same. So the way I think about VIA and what he was trying to do was certainly to provoke a response. And it's a little unclear what exactly were VIA's motives, only because he doesn't give any interviews. I was not able to find anything written from him to suggest exactly what he was thinking. So I'm taking from a few different sources. Friedrich Katz writes a great biography on VIA decades ago, and I think his analysis of it is pretty sound in my mind, that VIA was trying to provoke a response from the United States, as you had just described. And I think it's very similar with 9/11. One of the things that Osama bin Laden was looking to do was to provoke a response by the United States, to generate more publicity for his cause, to try to rally Muslims behind him, to challenge the United States to do something. I don't think he necessarily thought there would be an invasion of Afghanistan and boots on the ground to quite the same extent. But nevertheless, he was trying to provoke something. And I think that's what the tactics of terror are trying to do, in part, is to provoke a response against the entity you're going up against. And so I think there is a crucial similarity there between what VIA does in 1916 and what bin Laden's doing in the 1990s and on 9/11. Just to be mindful, like, why are these individuals doing what they're doing? And I think it's too facile just to say they hate our freedoms, they're evil. There's usually something more tangible behind it that these individuals are doing. And I think, with the 9/11 case, George W. Bush would often just reflexively say, bin Laden's evil, he's an evildoer, he's an evil man. And so that way we don't have to think about his challenges or why he did what he did. But it is important to get past facile terminology to try to understand why somebody would attack the United States as it did, as Pancho Villa does in 1916, as bin Laden does on 9/11, but to think through, why have they done this? And I think that would enable a better, more effective response to it.
About the Trump administration wanting to return to a sort of gunboat diplomacy focused on short, sharp interventions to serve as demonstrations of American power, exact revenge, and maybe force compliance with American wishes, kind of like the 12-Day War or the campaign in Venezuela, maybe the boat strikes in a sense, although that has ultimately continued for quite some time now. But the Villa expedition appeared to be such a conflict, and we didn't end up capturing Villa. What should we take from this experience as we think about these types of campaigns moving forward?
A good question. Using these historical examples, I think the idea of having a lighter footprint. There are occasions where I think certainly military force is useful and effective. And in the course of the chapters that I've done, I think the one mission that stands out as fairly effective, both in terms of cost, the cost-benefit analysis, is the pursuit of Che Guevara when he was in Bolivia. The Bolivians, when they get wind that there might be some sort of rebel activity that Che Guevara may or may not be a part of, they're asking for the kitchen sink from the U.S. military. But the U.S. ambassador to Bolivia, guy Douglas Henderson, tries to pump the brakes on this. And like, we don't want to give them everything that the military wants, out of fear that the Bolivian military might one day use it against their own people, and doesn't want to be involved with that. Che Guevara was trying to instigate a wider conflict. This gets back to a point we were talking about a few moments ago. What's the utility from the so-called bandits' perspective? He wants to draw the United States into a quote unquote another Vietnam, but the U.S. doesn't take the bait, and I would give Ambassador Henderson most of the credit on that. He was the one on the ground. A lighter footprint. Give them the kinds of materials that we would probably we had been giving other Latin American states at the time to go up against rebel groups, but then also bring in Green Berets to train some Bolivian Rangers, a kind of a special forces unit to be able to go after Guevara and his men. And I think that lighter footprint is effective. It does go after Guevara's small group. It was a small ragtag group that was not all that well organized to begin with, but it is effective, and the United States does not get bogged down. There's no loss of life for Americans, and so it is effective in that way. And so I think that's an episode where I think it illustrates that a lighter footprint can sometimes be much more effective than a heavier one. So the punitive expedition for Villa, that's about 7,000 U.S. troops roaming around the northern Mexican desert, and U.S. forces encounter the soldiers of Carranza much more than Villa, and it nearly brings the United States and Mexico to the brink of war. And so that kind of heavy presence is something that very closely came to even greater conflict. And so the U.S. kind of avoids something bigger there. And this is also in the midst of World War I. Woodrow Wilson has his eye on what's going on in Europe. He doesn't want to get bogged down in a Mexican conflict at this time. I do think sometimes less is more. And that's something that I kind of get a sense of with some of the stories that I tell here.
Yeah, the Che Guevara case is really interesting to me, partly because it shows like you have an American ambassador during the Cold War. And, I think about a conversation I had with I think a retired diplomat, maybe a year or two ago, where they're talking about like, hey, we've realized that like if we're having trouble getting resources for something, we would do what we call waving the red flag, where we talk about, like, well, China is present in such and such country, and here's all the things they're doing here. And that this is a way to unlock resources. And similarly, in the Cold War, you have this dynamic of, hey, the Soviets and the communists are doing things in these countries. And there's this huge, our foreign policy at the time is very much oriented around countering Soviet and communist influence. And so it was very heartening to see an American diplomat basically pushing against that narrative. And basically saying, hey, like, yeah, this is a problem, but we don't need to really throw the kitchen sink at it. And actually, I think he used the word shakedown, like that these guys, the Bolivians, are coming to us trying to get all kinds of resources out of us. And as you point out, it probably would have been bad to grant that. And that was the other thing that was striking about this is Guevara has this very powerful image. You can get his face on a T-shirt still. Today, people know who he is. They argue about his legacy.
Massive murals in Nirvana.
He's got, the Cuban government is very excited about him, of course, as well. And the press at the time in America is arguing about him and talking about him, and they're, suggesting that he's this great revolutionary. When actually, it seems like he's got one successful revolution, and then two interventions in the Congo and in Bolivia that are almost like, a comedy of errors. You have people going off on these training marches and getting lost. And, Guevara is like sick with like dysentery or something and weighs something like 110 pounds at the end of one of the expeditions. I mean, it really is striking how big the gap is between how effective and dangerous we thought Che was and how effective and dangerous he actually was, which makes that ambassador's critical intervention in the diplomatic process all the more striking, where he says, hey, don't freak out about this. Don't go crazy in Bolivia. and he makes the right call.
Yeah, I'm nodding my head the entire time you're mentioning that, and it's a great read on Henderson in particular. Che's mission is a disaster. The one in the Congo is a mess. The one in Bolivia is really no better. I think from the Lyndon Johnson's administration's perspective, Che is dangerous, not necessarily because he may lead a successful rebellion in the Congo or Bolivia, but it was the power of his ideas, his rhetoric, his attractiveness, both physically and also rhetorically. Che gives an address to the United Nations in 1964. This is about 6 months or so before he quote unquote disappears. He is putting the United States on blast and trying to, I think, rally the so-called third world that capitalism has been a blight on millions and millions of people around the world. And I think from the Johnson administration's perspective, that kind of rhetoric is dangerous. Not necessarily because Che might lead a successful rebellion in one place, but that he could inspire others to try to do this kind of thing. And of course, this is also the era of the domino theory. And Che, I think, believed this to some extent as well. This is why he picks Congo in Central Africa, and that if that succeeds, then this is going to help spread revolution in neighboring places. He picks Bolivia because it's right in the heart of Central America, and if he can succeed there, it's going to spread to other places, including his native Argentina, which is his grand dream. But it goes nowhere. It's a total disaster in any way that you can imagine. They're not able to attract any local support. They barely speak the local indigenous languages. I think Che, to his credit, doesn't try to go after the civilian population in any kind of violent way. The contrast, I have the concluding chapter about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and ISIS. And ISIS is just slaughtering people left and right who would not go along with them. Che doesn't go down that route when he's in Bolivia. Nevertheless, he's not anywhere near the threats that I think there's some in the Johnson administration thought he was. And you do have the local U.S. officials who kind of call it right. So I think the case of Henderson in Bolivia, in the case of Pancho Villa, even before 1916, there are local councils, U.S. councils who are on the ground in Mexico. We're trying to tell the State Department, hey, this Villa guy, he might not be one we want to hitch our wagon to. So you do have these, I think, you have clearer pictures of these individuals by some of the diplomats on the ground, more so than the politicians in Washington.
Yeah, in light of the way that the Trump administration use the terminology of narco-terrorists, kind of combining two of these prior iterations of the bandit sort of iconography. The Venezuela intervention and the current Iran war have both really failed to generate a major rally around the flag effect in the way that previous U.S. interventions have. And I'm curious if you think this might make this sort of rhetorical posture of naming and shaming these bandits less effective, or the relative and only decreasing lack of a democratic process in our foreign policy makes generating the public support less important in the first place. So, it kind of just matters less. Really curious your perspective on that.
So I was struck, I think, beginning of last year when the Trump administration starts bombing so-called drug boats off of Venezuela. This is kind of in the lead up to Maduro removal, but blowing boats out of the water in off the coast of Venezuela. And the Trump administration and Trump himself was using some of the same kind of rhetoric that I cover in the book. And in fact, if I was still working on the book at this point, what was going on might have been the new conclusion. But he refers to, yes, he uses the term narco-terrorists, which is something that the CIA develops that term in the 1980s. So he calls them narco-terrorists. He calls these individuals unlawful enemy combatants, which straight out of the Bush administration, going up against insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Trump also uses the term savage. He gives a talk at the United Nations last September. And so he refers to these drug runners as savages. And all that kind of terminology, borrowing from the playbook that I point out in Chasing Bandits, justified the United States to blow these boats out of the water. To I think at last count we're approaching maybe 50 of these attacks, over 150 people killed, with no evidence that has been brought forth, and no identification of who these individuals were. And this is another case of bending or breaking established rules of engagement, because prior to this, if the Coast Guard had come across a suspected drug boat at sea, they would interdict the ships, stop the ships, search it, arrest these individuals, who would then be put on trial. That's not happening here. But by using the terminology like savage, unlawful combatant, narco-terrorist, this has given the Trump administration carte blanche to just do what it will to try to eliminate the threat. And I think that mission and those attacks, I think, were also pretext to kind of rattle the saber in front of Maduro before he was removed in January. So that's a different component than some of the stuff that I had written about in my book, because again, Maduro as a head of state, I think it's a different category of enemy. But you're right, there has not really been a rally around the flag moment, both for the Venezuela mission, but also what's going on in Iran right now. And I think that's also in part, I think for a variety of reasons, but one of them I think is chiefly the Trump administration has not effectively communicated why is the United States going to war in Iran. We've had, I think, 4 or 5 different primary reasons given for this attack, with no consistency. It seems to change daily about why the United States is doing this. Is it scaling down? Are we in negotiations? Or are we about to scale up? Are we going to start bombing civilian facilities or not? I think the inconsistency is a big part of that. One of the things that I think made 9/11 or the early days of the global war on terror so effective, not just the rally around the flag moment because the United States got hit in such a spectacular way, but the Bush administration was able to, I think, effectively frame bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, in such a way that resonated with many Americans. And we just don't see that, I think, with the current Trump administration. And I think there's also a question of, well, what is it the United States is doing here? What's going on? What's the real reason for this? And again, there's no effective communication over it. I mean, I as I look into it too, I can't really see what's the benefit here. I just kind of been shaking my head, historically speaking.
Another trend line that has interested me is the pattern of tying non-state bandits to state actors rhetorically. I know after 9/11, you had the very early, very concerted campaign to tie Saddam Hussein's Iraq to 9/11, such that within, I think it was, by the time the Iraq War had started, 84% of Americans believed that there was a link between Iraq and 9/11. Obviously, there was also the campaign in the Maduro indictment, alleging that he was running a cartel de los soles, which turned out to be a broader term for corruption between the Venezuelan military and drug organizations. Not a straight up, hey, Maduro was making these orders as the head of this narco trafficking cartel. And all of this is taking place in the aftermath, ironically, of the sort of decline of actual state-sponsored terror, which was predominantly a tool of Cold War era politics. But as you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of that iteration of great power competition, you had terror organizations acquire funding by going to different sources, engaging in different criminal activities, things like that. So I'm really curious if this trend of tying non-state bandits to state actors is really as new as it seems, or if it has earlier kind of precedents that you can draw upon.
Well, I think, yeah, certainly with post 9/11 one with tying Al-Qaeda with Iraq, this idea that some penny ante kind of tiny group can't do that kind of damage to us. It has to come from a country that has real resources, right? I think that was one of the prevailing presumptions for quite some time. And it didn't really cost much. I mean, 9/11, I think the estimate is that 9/11 probably cost Al Qaeda a grand total of $500,000 to pull off. And meanwhile, the United States has committed an estimated $8 trillion since then in the global war on terror to prevent anything like that from happening again. And that's where I get back, before about, the weighing the cost and benefit of these things. But in terms of, connections with other states, the closest one I can think of is the Che Guevara case, where Che had been part of the Cuban government after it succeeds in the revolution in 1959. And he's made a bureaucrat in the Cuban government for a few years. And it's the kind of bureaucratic work that he does not like to do. He also was very wary of increasing Soviet influence, kind of running afoul of the Soviet version of how to more effectively spread socialism. They just had a difference of opinion. And so this is where Che formally resigns his positions in 1965. He does so quietly. He gives a letter and Castro literally puts it in his back pocket for a few months before he announces it. And so this is why Che I consider to be a non-state actor. And so hence why I think he fits into this book. However, he is getting assistance from Fidel Castro, first in Congo and then in Bolivia. To some extent, it's not like he gets these huge detachments of soldiers, or he doesn't necessarily have a blank check to have any kind of resources that he wants, but he is getting some assistance from Castro. And one of the reasons why the mission in Bolivia fails as spectacularly as it does in 1967 is because he is cut off from access to Havana. Like, their radios don't work anymore. Some of their connecting people they lose track of. And so the state help, minimal though it was from Fidel, that goes by the wayside, and that prevents him from developing this any further. And in some of the other cases that I have, in the Philippines, for example, Aguinaldo was hoping that he would be the state, that he would develop a Filipino government. In fact, he declares one. He declares himself president at one point, just to kind of give himself some sort of legitimacy. But he's not able to put that into practice because of the American presence and the American resistance there. And Pancho Villa, likewise, is in the midst of the Mexican Revolution, trying to fight for control of the Mexican state, and he's on the losing side by 1916. He's definitely on his heels. And so he's not able to tap into other state resources, just his own private militia. So these are aspects where these individuals are trying to, connect with a state or become a state, but they're not able to.
Yeah, just to conclude, another book you've written, America's Forgotten Colony, Cuba's Isle of Pines. How does this often forgotten, as you mentioned, little island fit into America's broader story and the broader story of U.S. empire and military engagement abroad? Yeah,
that's a project near and dear to my heart. That was a spinoff of my dissertation. And even that story came about. I've always been curious about the United States' place in the world. And how did the United States get to be the big superpower that it is today? Or maybe it's not today, I don't know anymore, but it was when I was starting graduate school. And, I kept drilling down, looking for stories to try to enlighten me on how does it that the United States became this? And so I always drilled down to United States in Latin America, United States in Cuba, and then kind of come to find that there were these Americans after 1898 who were moving to this little island off the coast of Cuba proper. And they moved there thinking that this is going to be American territory. They read the Treaty of Paris with Spain in such a way that leads them to believe that this little island, which essentially, as Nantucket is to Massachusetts, that's what the Isle of Pines is to Cuba. But these particular Americans kind of see this as, oh no, you can read it a certain way where it splits off. It's not part of quote unquote Cuba proper. And so this has been a largely overlooked island even prior to the U.S. presence after 1898. And they see this as virgin territory to develop a colony according to a Jeffersonian agrarian ethic that, the United States is becoming much more industrialized and urbanized. Here's a place where somebody can make a new place for themselves. This is another frontier. The frontier had been closed, right? Quote unquote, closed, going back to earlier in the 1890s. And so those who are anxious about, well, okay, we don't have any more land, which obviously was not true, but that was kind of one of the popular perceptions at the time. Here's this new frontier for an agrarian ethic to take hold. Beautiful weather, and you can retire there, or you could grow citrus there and live high off the hog there. And it doesn't work for many of these people. I've seen a variety of estimates, but most of them suggest that maybe about 2,000 Americans live there at its peak. And there were other American colonies across Cuba proper at the time. But you do have this concentration of Americans who purchase a lot of the arable land there, and they're looking to develop a new place. They're hoping that the flag will follow them in this new locale, but it doesn't work for the vast majority who go there. I mean, it is a failed American colony. The Theodore Roosevelt administration realizes that there's really not much strategically that's useful to the United States. And so there is a clause in the Platt Amendment that kind of links the United States and Cuba, basically makes Cuba a protectorate of the United States. There was a clause in there that said that the title to the Isle of Pines would be determined by a separate treaty. So there is a separate agreement in which the United States essentially cedes any sort of claim to the Isle of Pines in exchange for a nice harbor at a place called Guantanamo Bay. That was a much more effective place to station an American naval base than the Isle of Pines. The Isle of Pines, when the waters around it, particularly to the north, east, and west, are far too shallow, and then to the south, it just drops off. So it's not a great place for a naval base, but Guantanamo Bay was perfect. So the Roosevelt administration says, okay, we don't need anything. Isle of Pines, yeah, Cuba, you can have that. We'll take a lease here on Guantanamo Bay instead. So those Americans who had bought land thinking that it was going to be the next American colony, they feel betrayed. Those who try to tough it out, they don't realize that there are hurricanes that come across here every 5 to 7 years. And those who had tried to grow citrus, tried to live off of grapefruit and so forth there to fund their ventures, it would take 4 or 5 years for these grapefruit to finally start to ripen and to be useful for selling. And then every 5 or 7 years, there's going to be a hurricane that's going to wipe it out. And so they would lose everything. So a lot of these Americans lose their shirts in this venture. And so a lot of Americans will leave by the late 1910s, early 1920s. But a handful stick around. There will be some who stay right up to the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And one of the things that I chronicle in the book is kind of this shift over these decades. The book really kind of chronicles 1899 to about 1959 here. These Americans who initially are trying to dominate the land in the early 20th century. And they are welcomed because they're bringing in capital and they're bringing in investment and development that Spain had not done. So there is some sense of welcome, but the Americans they're not learning to speak Spanish. They're not trying to learn any of the local customs. They think this is going to be American territory. And then when it's not, fast forward a few decades, those Americans who stay try to integrate themselves more socially and culturally with the rest of the people on the island. And so by the 1950s, it's clearly Cuban territory. But these Americans, they stick around and they are part of a very kind of cosmopolitan sense of community on the island. But then when the Castro Revolution succeeds in 1959, they all start to leave. They know their land's going to get expropriated, and that's kind of where I end that story. But it's an interesting trajectory, I find, because what you see on the Isle of Pines is this blending of American expansionism. Most historical studies will say that American expansionism is mostly territorially oriented in the 18th and 19th century. And then in the 20th century, it's more commercially oriented expansionism. And what I see on the Isle of Pines is a blending of this. There is some territorial ambition. This is one of the last gasps of manifest destiny. But there is also this very important commercial component that these Americans are a part of. So I think it also is reflective of the broader story of American expansionism.
Dr. Michael Neagle, thank you for coming on Security Dilemma.
Thank you very much, guys.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the Jon Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security Dilemma.